Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe and stream The Groundless Ground on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, TuneIn, and YouTube. And of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. This is a very special episode with Beverly Kane, MD, discussing her book, Equanimity, which introduces us to Somatic Horsemanship, a therapeutic practice for exploring the physical relationship between humans and horses on the ground and on the horse to promote body, mind, spirit, well-being in both species. Dr. Kane portrays horses as consummate teachers of healthy embodiment and emotional resilience, and describes interventions like medical qigong that help patients learn how to regulate and heal nervous system and psychological dysfunction. She tells us about somatointuitive skills horses naturally use, like presentiment and going back to grazing, which we can model and implement to enrich our daily lives. This is both an informative and enchanting dialogue, and a great way to kick off 2022 with a heartfelt wish for total health. Beverly Kane, we have not been in each other's presence for a number of years, and I am so excited that your book, Equanimity, Stress Reduction and Emotional Self-Regulation in the Company of Horses, has finally been published. I know that among the SE community, there are a tremendous number of somatic experiencing practitioners who either have great interest in equine psychotherapy, being with horses and using them in healing contexts. In my mind, you are one of the great pioneers, particularly in its application in medicine. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a long time. And I just have to say, not a week that goes by that I don't think of your teaching and the classes we had together. What I remember about you is that you also had horses in your life at some point. Is that right?
When I was a child, yeah. Sadly for me, so far, I actually have not had direct experience with equine psychotherapy.
Please
Yeah,
come to the ranch because
I
we
will.
have been able to function fairly normally this whole past year.
I am truly excited about the conversation that we're going to have. And I think one of the best ways for us to start, and you do this so beautifully in your book, is to give the listeners a sense of your journey, not just with medicine, you are a physician, but also with incorporating horse learning, horse relationship as a methodology for helping people, particularly doctors, understand how to relate to other human beings in a compassionate and present way. Tell us about this journey first, and then we will get into the mechanics of the actual work.
Well, my journey with horses started out in a fairly mundane way. I was not a little horsey girl. I had virtually no consciousness of horses growing up around the Boston area because the horsey set was very elite back then. It was more the National Velvet type, hunter jumper type set. And other than watching a lot of cowboy movies from some other era, I had no consciousness of horses. I taught swimming, I surfed, I did everything else. And in fact, I was quite athletic. Then when I was the big 50, two things happened. One is I got laid off from a company called WebMD, which probably a lot of listeners heard of, especially since over the years they've added more alternative medicine and integrative medicine content. I got laid off from WebMD with a huge severance package where I could do anything I wanted. I panicked a little bit, not knowing what my next step was and not really being forced into anything. And the other thing that happening as a process was that I felt my physical body getting somewhat middle-aged. And although I was still very active and super healthy and very athletic for my age, I was not as fit and strong and graceful and flexible as I had been half that age, like 25. Those two things combined, having a lot of time, feeling my body changing, and also my lifelong love of animals, made me say, in answer to my best friend who was listening to my tales of woe, if you could do anything, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like to learn to ride horses, which I had board of attempts at doing off and on in my corporate life. But I traveled so much for business and worked 90-hour work weeks that it just wasn't possible to start anything like that with any degree of consistency and commitment. So I started taking riding lessons and it was fun. And I loved the horses, that total body connection with this large animal, which is really different from the connection that I have with cats and dogs, which is also deep, but not whole body like that. So there I was riding for a couple of years, and I got bucked off a kitchen table, broke my foot, dislocated my elbow, sprained my wrist. If I were a horse, I'd be called three-legged lame. I saw all kinds of practitioners, a traditional Chinese traumatologist, physical therapist, orthopedist, and the ortho guy said, "You can't ride, while you're rehabbing." And I said, "Can't ride?" It had become so much a part of my life. My first instinct was, screw you, I'm going to do this. And even though there wasn't a specific biomechanical limitation that I had from riding, because I actually broke the foot opposite to where you step up with the stirrup, I knew that I couldn't sustain another fall, so I had to be careful. So the compromise was to enroll as a client in the National Center for Equine Facilitated Therapy in Woodside in therapeutic riding. And in therapeutic riding, you don't even control the horse. You have no reins. You're riding bareback, which I have done anyway, a little bit. So there's no saddle, no rein. Somebody else leads the horse. You have two sidewalkers and a therapeutic riding instructor that tells you how to move your body. And I got up there and it was so amazing just to be in my body and not to think, am I doing this right? Am I riding correctly? Are my hands correct? Is my seat correct? Is my posture correct? And I just wept. I wept and wept and wept. I had been doing equine assisted learning from a psychological and a practical sense with corporate people and medical people, teaching doctor patient communication. And it was a very structured, somewhat psychological, but it was very skills oriented. And it was not what I would call somatic at all. So after this therapeutic riding experience, I remembered in my body and in my consciousness that the reason that I came to horses was as a somatic experience for myself. From then on, I said, well, I really want to do somatic work, because by that time I was teaching Tai Chi at Stanford, and I had a background in dance and, of course, athletics, and I had a sports medicine medical practice in downtown San Francisco. This all came together in tears rolling down my cheeks. And so I set about creating this program that combined the teaching of Tai Chi and psychoenergetics that go with Tai Chi, the energy centers and the energy circulation and the energy cultivation. It was with my therapeutic riding instructor that we developed this program. Initially, I worked with disabled veterans, and she had a little 10-page booklet for the vets that she gave me to start my syllabus for Stanford for this equanimity course. That 10-page booklet is now this 316-page book. And something personal that I have to share, the whole thing, probably all told, at least 10 years since I was a client there. I just today presented her with her copy of the book, and we were both crying.
It's so interesting. I'm detecting a very specific move that you made and your experience of using relationship with horses as a method for embodiment. Even though when I read the book, I got this, somehow right now I'm really getting that somatic horsemanship, which is the term you use. I can see why these therapeutic methods that have existed for people to, for instance, therapeutically be with horses was different than this direct experience that you had of embodied connection with a horse, not just on top of the horse, but with all the things we're going to discuss about how to be with a horse. And so I can see why somatic horsemanship, which you define as the practice of exploring physical relationship between humans and horses in order to promote physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health in both species. This is about connecting in relationship where all the beings involved find benefit.
That's such an important point because a lot of the riding disciplines, and even one of the controversies in equine assisted learning and therapy, is the extent to which we consider the horse a tool. And you will see some schools of equine assisted psychotherapy talk about the horse as a tool in the way that a sandbox or a piano is a tool in sand therapy and music therapy. One of the distinguishing features of somatic horsemanship and psycho-spiritual equine assisted learning is this idea of the horse as a sentient being, as an energetic being that has energy centers that are very analogous to our energy centers. If you look at acupuncture charts of horses, they're really based on the human acupuncture charts and meridians. The energy centers in our palms, the Laogung centers, and the Yuanchen centers in the feet. Horses have all that. And when we sit on horses, that is also an ethical question for a lot of people. We are grounding through those analogous energy centers in the horse, and you can feel it. One of the most powerful experiences I've had since I've started this is when the Shaolin monks from the Shaolin Temple, USA, San Francisco, came over to the ranch to do energy sensing on the horses. It was a real revelation for me because as much as I had been trying to blend my Dantian, Hara energy center and yoga, it's the Swadhisthana chakra energy center with the horse. There was a part I was missing that the head monk added. It's in the chapter in the book called The Chi Also Rises. I had been trying to sink my chi down, down, down into the ground through the horse. I thought that was the way to have balanced equitation. I asked him about that. I said, well, so when you're riding a horse, are you sinking your chi down, down, down to connect, to ground, and to balance? And he said, yes, but you have to remember the chi circulates, it goes up and down. That was another light bulb that went off for me because I had actually used, with some consternation and skepticism, a practice called microcosmic orbit.
I was just going to say, as I was reading this part of the book, I am thinking to myself, oh, this is microcosmic orbit. Although I have done several shows on Qigong, there may be listeners who don't actually know what we are referring to here. In your book, you actually really are trying to give a methodology. You've been using Qigong and the principles of Qigong to help people experience embodiment in a very different way so that they can connect naturally with the way the horses probably naturally experience their embodiment. So, right now we're using Qigong terms. So, if you want to describe microcosmic orbit, go for it.
I'll be happy to describe it briefly, and then I want to talk about the particular forms we use in equanimity and why we chose those. So, microcosmic orbit, and again, I was very skeptical of it. It just seemed a little too far out for me. It just didn't seem natural. It's a method of circulating your energy. Different people have different ideas about where it starts and where it goes and where it ends. It starts either in the dantian, or some people will tell you it starts in the perineum. And it's this imaginary channel that goes from the perineum up the back, over the top of the head, and back down to the perineum. I actually like starting it and ending it in the dantian. So it's a meditation, and you coordinate imagery of circulating the chi in the microcosmic orbit with your breath. It never felt right to me until I realized that my riding instructors were essentially telling me the same thing about the muscle mechanics of the horse and how the energy has to come up from the hindquarters. And so, with what I had been experiencing with blending the dantian and the hands and feet energy centers, I thought, what if I do the microcosmic orbit and include the horse in it and feel the energy come from the horse's hind end over my head and down through the
Wow.
horse again. And that has just helped my riding and also my relationship with my horse tremendously. I'd like to say a couple of words about the particular form we use, especially since it seems that some of your listeners are familiar with Qigong. So, one of the classic Qigong forms is called the Baduan Jin. Translated, it means essentially the 8 pieces of brocade or the 8 silken movements. And not only do I love this form as a form, it's one of the 3 forms, which also includes the 5 animals form, that is being most assiduously researched, particularly in Beijing, for various forms of healing, but particularly in cancer patients. And the data on the Baduan Jin in several cancer centers in Beijing show that the Baduan Jin helps cancer patients reduce pain, reduce depression, increase appetite, increase sociability, which is a big issue with cancer patients. There are the beginnings of studies of evidence that show increased survival. Having said all that, I just plain love the form because it's really easy to do and because it's specifically connected with releasing negative emotions and gathering in positive emotions. So as you do the form, you coordinate your breath with the release of anger, the release of depression, sadness, the release of anxiety, and you welcome in courage and joy. So we do a form called the Wu Duan Jin. Wu means 5 because there are 3 of the Ba Duan Jin that you can't really do on horseback, like bending over and touching your toes. And so we do the Wu Duan Jin, and it works out really well. The horses love it. It's very easy to do. There's no pretzely things like in yoga. It's not a very complex form. Tai Chi can be very complex, but it's really easy. Most of the participants that come to Stanford Equanimity are middle-aged women, sometimes with various infirmities. And it's very, very easy for people to do. One of my favorite studies that I quote in the book, they looked at 4 groups and they looked at heart rate variability, which is a proxy measurement for the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is the system that activates to relax us, instigates what we call the feed and breed or rest and recover response. A proxy for how that system is functioning is a derived quantity called heart rate variability, the variation in the rhythm of the heart. A study looked at heart rate variability in 4 groups of people when they were presented with a stressor, and they looked at a group that only did deep breathing, as in sitting meditation, a group that did physical exercise, a group that did nothing, and a group that did both deep breathing and the muscle movement. And it turned out the lowest heart rate variability, or the best, was in the group, can you guess?
Where they did both.
That suggests that activities like Qigong are more beneficial as an anti-stress intervention
Mhm.
than exercise alone or sitting meditation alone.
Again, what I'm hearing is that because humans tend to have disturbance in their system, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, the Qigong is a way to mitigate, smooth out some of that systemic disturbance, create more systemic regulation. One of my favorite lines from your book, you say that horses are consummate teachers of healthy embodiment and emotional resiliency. Any of us who work with patients and give them skills to cultivate embodiment and emotional resilience, we know when a human's disturbed, a horse might really not be so happy to be around that kind of disturbance, and that offering a way for people to experience more of their own embodiment, more regulation, might actually help the somatic horsemanship go a little better.
Yes, and an important point about that is that horses are actually comfortable with our extreme emotions if we're aware of them and express them. What they don't seem to do well with what we like to call incongruency, which of course horses don't conceptualize semantically incongruency, but it's the person who shows up with the big smile while they're crashing on the inside, while they're crying on the inside. It seems to set up some kind of disharmony. It could be as easy an explanation as muscle tensions. I personally don't think that's the only thing that's happening. I think there's something more subtle that's not necessarily muscle fasciculations. Even though horses don't have the verbal concept of incongruency, they sense on some very subtle level that there's a disconnect between what we're saying and what we're feeling. Particularly teenage girls, for some reason, but grown women go out to their horses and cry into their mane. And the horses are fine with that. It's a good feeling to be able to go up to your horse and say, I'm really sad, I'm really tired today, and not try to fake it, because that's not physiologically good for people. If people don't acknowledge their internal states, they can get pretty sick mentally and of course physically. The stress chapter on this book, although I tried to avoid reinventing the stress chapter wheel, it's really important to understand some of the basic mechanisms by which unacknowledged, denied stress that's swept under the rug can lead to physical problems. Can I say something else about the resiliency since you used that word? Horses are the poster animals for resiliency. One of the important concepts all along in equanimity, and certainly in the book, is this concept of back to grazing. Subjectively, phenomenologically, what we're doing is trying to be like horses. Now, horses are big and strong, but they're very spooky. They're very sensitive, and they have a lot of fears, and they are afraid of things that other animals wouldn't necessarily be afraid of because they're prey animals. They're not predators like dogs and cats. So, for instance, a plastic bag blowing across the trail can really set a horse off. We have a lot of coyotes and some mountain lions at the ranch, and they will pick up on that and react, sometimes not to the coyotes really, but occasionally when the mountain lions come down from Jasper Ridge down close to the pasture. The good thing about these spooks and these shies and these startle reactions is that they're very temporary, because once the horse ascertains that the danger is past, if it really even was a danger to start with, they sooner or later see the plastic bag isn't a mountain lion. They let go of that so quickly, and they literally go back to grazing a split second after their trauma. Whereas we, especially women, hold on to our trauma hours, days, months, years after it's passed. And some traumas certainly warrant that. Most of our minor traumas that we face during the day, a cup breaks, or we get a flat tire, or somebody hurts our feelings, we just hang on to that rather than go back to grazing. The way that we go back to grazing, and sometimes we have oral habits like smoking and chewing gum and overeating food. It turns out that one of the best back to grazing antidotes is qigong or yoga
Right.
or exercise or mindfulness meditation.
Those of us who ascribe to and clinically use polyvagal theory, as well as the frame that basically acknowledges certain people may, in fact, have chronic episodes during their childhood where their autonomic nervous system is continually being driven into freeze, which is actually the third way to seek safety. And underneath the vagal brake is all of this agitation, all the fear is still there. So what happens is their autonomic nervous system doesn't really have that optimal arousal capacity to kind of come up when you need the energy and then deactivate into rest and digest. They get stuck in this chronic
Mhm.
overactivation. And Qigong has this wonderful way of settling the winds or the qi back into the lower dantian, or you can imagine it between the lower dantian and the perineum, specific subtle body wind. It lives there normally, but for most modern humans, because of the stress people are under continually, or because of habits the nervous system has developed from repeated childhood traumatic experience, that wind gets stuck either in the chest, it gets stuck in the throat, it gets stuck in the forehead. And so Qigong has this wonderful way of regulating the system and allowing the individual to really learn how to regulate the autonomic nervous system on their own. So that whenever something shows up that may take the system over a threshold, or whenever there's some kind of challenge to the system, they can sense whether the system's having some trouble going back to grazing, as you call it. And I love this analogy, going back to grazing. And I thought to myself, there must be something in the somatic horsemanship at some point where people observe their horse enough grazing that if they don't know what grazing is, they somatically get it at some point. Do you find that's the case?
Yes, I do mention in the book people who are chronically abused, people who live in the refugee camps where they're under constant political
Right.
persecution. That's a whole nother level of sympathetic activation that I'm really fascinated to hear you talk about, especially with regard to Qigong.
I actually want to qualify this. The ACE studies out of Kaiser, which was 17,000 patients coming in for whatever they were coming in for, just handed a questionnaire. How many kinds of trauma have you experienced? Not how many events, but how many categories. Anyone who had four or more, the correlation was tremendous adult disease, both psychological disease as well as physical. So the person whose boss yelled at them may in fact be someone whose system was already in a compromised way of functioning before they got into their adult work world, and they don't have quote unquote resilience the way
Yeah.
people think they should. But that's generally just because the system's already wonkily functioning.
It's important to know that grazing, you mentioned some people have never really experienced a horse grazing. Grazing is not eating.
Right.
Horses have meals, but in between they'll graze. And that point was brought home to me once when we brought two horses to the Stanford Wellness Fair, and we had them in a little electric pen. I think it was probably 50, 60 feet on a side. And we brought piles of hay for them because they were there for 4 to 6 hours that day before and after the actual people came to the fair. And they barely touched the hay, but they grazed all those hours on the Stanford lawn, which we had ascertained prior to bringing them there. They wanted to graze rather than eat because they were just under sensory overload at that fair. There were 3,000 people that day.
Mm.
And as you can imagine, probably half of those wanted selfies with the horses. Then the Stanford marching band came by, and there were the horses just grazing and grazing and grazing, and they didn't spook and they didn't show any signs of anxiety. For me, grazing my horse is one of the most relaxing things that I
Mm.
can do because she's so happy doing that. And that's after she's had a big breakfast too. She'll go out and just graze. The idea of being in that kind of meditation for a good part of the day is a lesson for us.
True. At one point in the book, you talk about presentiment, which I found fascinating. Maybe you would just talk a little bit about what you called advanced somatic knowing, which frankly I see all the time in the room with my patients. I would love to have you talk about presentiment and how it shows up, not just for horses, but also for humans.
Presentiment is the ability of the body to sense something before it happens. The most innovative and conclusive and startling and ingenious and elegant work in this field has been done by Dean Radin. He was the first person to get a doctorate in parapsychology at UC Berkeley. And he works at the Institute of Noetic Sciences now, which funds some of his research. And he did studies measuring the skin resistance in participants as a measure of stress and anxiety and sympathetic activation. Long story short, he found that the body reacted to stress. In this case, it was disturbing photographs that people were shown of violence and horror and war. The body reacted to those photos 5 to 9 seconds before they were actually shown to the person, before the person cognitively registered that they were seeing these pictures. It's like precognition, but it's in the body. The HeartMath people, Roland McCready and his coworkers, have reproduced that, looking not at skin resistance, but again at heart rate variability. There have been 2 studies in animals, earthworms and birds that were afraid of snakes, and they showed the same thing. These animals, their bodies reacted up to 9 seconds before they were presented with the stimulus. So the body has precognitive, or what we call presentient. That's Dean's word is presentiment, presentience.
This was in the book for a really particular reason when it comes to horses.
Well, we don't know whether horses are reacting to us that way, but if we believe in this phenomenon, if we understand that phenomenon, and we've somewhat felt it in ourselves, butterflies in the stomach or a creepy feeling on your neck before something happens, particularly if you ride horses and you find that they pre-guess what you're about to ask them, then you start becoming a believer. And that's not necessarily people who ride patterns in an arena for dressage, but it can be out on the trail too. Stories abound of horses that sense that there's quicksand up ahead, even before they come up upon it. They can sense obstacles on the trail that don't really have a physical sensory component. And they
Right.
certainly sense in our bodies what we might be asking for, we might be intending even before we know.
So when you're doing the somatic horsemanship where you're not on the horse, you're with the horse, do you ever notice that the horse will precognize some relational interaction or feeling that is about to occur?
It's hard to know on the ground what the person's intention is because sometimes that's not even conscious in the person. The person can't always verbalize what they're getting from the horse. What's interesting though is that when I take people out into this herd of 50 horses in the pasture, it's really interesting which horse will come up to any given person. One interesting story is that I had a client that I took out into pasture, and there was a disturbance about 50 yards away from us that
Mm.
we were looking at. A horse actually broke his tie line and had gotten out. Although when I take people into the herd, I usually have 20 sets of antenna up for where the horses are and how they might be approaching us. This time we were so involved with what was happening with this loose horse that I sort of lost focus. And actually, this particular client had had her own barn in England. So she was a very savvy horse person herself, but neither one of us felt the approach of this horse. And this horse put her nose onto this client's back. So the first clue that we had that this horse was around us was her nosing into the client's back. And the client just got very emotional at that point, and she said, I've been having back pain for 6 months now, and I haven't seen anybody about it because I just haven't had the time to do anything for myself. And here was this horse that came along and nosed her in the back, and that horse had never done that before.
Mm.
None of the horses really nosed into people, but here was this horse that went right for her pain.
So in the book, you talk about a somatointuitive wisdom that horses use, particularly when they're deciding who to have friendship with.
It's hard to know what they're picking up on, and it works both ways. There's some kind of intangible, nonverbal connection. One of my personal favorite stories, and I've seen it in various forms in the work that I've done, although maybe not so dramatically, is the story of this little girl. I think I call her Amy, who was working with a psychotherapist back east. And Amy was the daughter of alcoholic parents that had divorced. And she was going from alcoholic parent to alcoholic parent. She was what we used to call an at-risk kid. She was 14. Her equine assisted psychotherapist took her out into a small herd of about 5 horses. And Amy went around petting the horses, just kind of feeling the horses, just kind of getting to know them. And she stopped at this one chestnut mare, and Amy got very, very sad and started to cry. She said to the therapist, "I don't know why I'm crying. I just feel like this horse is really sad." And the therapist explained to Amy that the mare had lost a foal. The foal was stillborn, and maybe the mare was feeling sad on that account. So Amy at that point said to the therapist, "Well, nobody knows this, but I had an abortion 3 months ago." The therapist was just blown away at the connection, the emotional connection, and the presentiment, somatopathic empathy between Amy and this mare.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty powerful connection.
It's a beautiful example of bottom up as opposed to top down. Our medical system and our psychological system is so titrated toward top down. Everything gets done from thoughts, some kind of mentalizing, and then applying that into embodied experience. And I think this is really great proof that the body itself is such a complex organism which has so many functions and strengths that we are not conscious of because 90% of our functioning is under the hood. We're not conscious of the enormity of the wisdom that the organism has. But when we have this relationship, like Amy had with the horse, speaking, verbalizing an experience body to body that only bodies can produce.
Right. It's such kismet that it came out, because this might not have come out in office therapy ever. What's interesting to me too is that a lot of equine assisted psychotherapists also maintain office practices. They all have stories about where they literally hit a wall with talk therapy, especially if you have very smart patients. Sometimes they're able to have really astonishing breakthroughs by bringing a patient like that out to the herd and just without any guidance, let whatever's going to happen, that kismet, that somatopathic connection just happen. Because in general, in all the healing professions, we're just so attached to having something happen, to having the person get better, that it's very hard to not. I think even the best psychotherapists often will have an agenda or something that they hope, whereas that really tends to go away when you realize that the primary relationship is not the patient and the therapist, it's the patient and the horse. When you learn to just let that happen, let the body connection happen, let the physicality of the horse do something to that patient that they don't necessarily experience in the verbal realm, then you see some astonishing things like that. People project both with their minds and their bodies, and we encourage that. But it's really a process of learning to take oneself out of the equation and just let the horse and the participant develop that relationship.
You have a methodology that is kind of a stepped process when you take someone through this work, which you can definitely correct me if I got this wrong, but it seems like there's meeting a horse and then petting a horse and grooming a horse and then finally leading a horse by learning how horses lead each other. Did I get that right?
Yes, I would say 90% of the people that come to me have never been around a horse. And some of them are downright afraid of horses, but they have this sense that this is what they need to do. I'm not sure how that happens. So we go very, very slowly. And even though there are 4 phases, with individuals, they may stay at the meet and greet phase for weeks. And especially if that's out in the herd, then every time they come, it's a different horse and a different experience, and they're in a different frame of body. And I've done that for 20 years that I've been with horses. Sometimes I just go out there and meet and greet and go around to the different horses. How are you today? And sense the energy, or just soak it all in. And the second phase, as you said, is usually grooming as a meditation, not as a way to make the horse pretty or make the horse clean. It's the first sensing of an exchange of energy. What does the horse like to do? What do you like to do? The third phase is typically leading. And the most fun we have with that is when it's a class and we have 3 or 4 people leading a horse, taking turns with a lead rope, learning to feel that Dantian connection.
Do they feel it through the rope?
I don't believe that they feel the energetic connection through the rope, although they might because that's what they're used to. I have no objection to leading a horse around with a halter or doing anything that's in their repertoire, even if it's, or especially since it's traditional. It's what they feel comfortable with. That's why when we teach grooming, we use the grooming tools because that's essentially what the horse is comfortable with, the brush and the curry comb. And so for leading, they're fully comfortable with the lead rope and the halter, but we try to teach the participants to also feel that connection through the dantian and the whole body as an energy radiator. We do a fair amount with Reiki. I call it Reiki gong. We think of the body as a total body Reiki radiator and receptor. That energetic connection is through the energy centers, but also just all over the body, almost as a field. And the fun that we have with that is that we do an exercise where a team of 4 will take turns leading a horse with the lead rope and the halter. Then we take off the halters and we see if the groups stay together energetically. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can walk all over the arena together, and the horse will lead or follow, and the group all stays together. And sometimes they just fall apart. It's just fun to see what people's experience is energetically of that body connection and breaking that connection, where they feel it and how it works.
I don't say this in a suspicious way. I say this with such interest. When you are taking the medical students through this kind of experience, Stanford medical students, are you also teaching them Qigong and Reiki and getting them to have some relationship with what I call the subtle body nervous system? Are you actually doing that with them as well?
I am actually doing that. Aside from the horses, I teach a course called Medical Tai Chi. The secret is that the first half hour is Qigong, and it's virtually the same Qigong. It's actually a little bit different because it's a little bit more Shaolin style Qigong that I teach for equanimity. It's called Medical Tai Chi because we study the peer reviewed articles on the health benefit of Tai Chi and Qigong. They kind of need that grounding in traditional research, but I also teach them a different model, a phenomenological model, and some other models that have been developed to study integrative medicine and techniques like Qigong and Tai Chi that don't lend themselves to fulfilling the Western medical gold standard criteria of large groups, long term case controls, controlling all the variables. How are you going to do that research with horses? You have 50 different horses and thousands of participants. It's not like developing the COVID vaccine where you can have very controlled studies with placebos and things like that. What's a placebo horse?
There's no such thing as replicating a surgery. Every patient is different. Every surgical procedure is different. To
Yeah.
say that it's controlled,
Western medicine thinks they're controlling everything, but they don't understand all the subtle features. Someday they absolutely will. Oh, even psychotherapy has a history of being challenged by the medical model. I'm amazed at some of the studies that have been accomplished with Tai Chi and Qigong using traditional measurements. I mean, to some extent, you can do that. Things that are more measurable, like flexibility, where you can make measurements, stress, where you can measure cortisol. I have resisted doing any research on what I do because I think phenomenologically it speaks for itself. It proves itself from what I see that people go through, from what people say about the class, about what happens for them. Because we do a check in every week too, and people get deeper into their personal experiences. And it's really interesting how they open up and how they seem to get better.
during the 4 week class, do you notice that the participants will start talking about how they might be experiencing their life differently in between the period when you have the classes?
They will come back with stories of, how they noticed things, how they became generally more aware of their bodies in between the classes. And with each 4-week class, they get a private session too, particularly if they do their private session towards the end of the class. They really have a familiarity and a fluency with the language of acknowledging their somatic awareness, of expressing their stress, of expressing what makes them feel better.
So when they have the private session, is it just them and you and one horse, or them and a herd of horses and you?
They get to choose. Initially, I usually take them out in the herd because even for people who've been around horses all their lives, sometimes that's just horses in stalls or a couple of horses in a corral. The idea of going out into this beautiful sunny pasture surrounded by forested hills
Mm.
with 50 or 60 horses is just phenomenal. There just aren't words to describe. And somewhat selfishly, that's my first choice for the first session. Then, if they come back for more sessions, they get a choice of whether they want to groom, whether they want to take a walk with a horse. I've had marathon runners jog with our horses, which is fun to see because I can't keep up with her, but you have a really good runner and they can almost run at canter speed. So it's really whatever they want to do that day, very unstructured and it's very unplanned usually. We take stock of how the person feels inside their body and what they want to experience that day. When we go out into the herd, it ends up being a lot of one-on-one experiences with particular horses that they can choose to make a physical connection with. Did you ever play red light, green light when you were a kid?
Of course.
I have so many people that come from other countries and other cultures that I don't assume that they know how to play that, but we do that with the horses. Though the horse doesn't isn't blindfolded and they're usually doing something else, so we come a little bit closer and if the horse becomes aware of you, we stop. That's red light. And then when the horse goes back to grazing, that's green light and we see how far we can come till the point where the horse either approaches the person and initiates physical contact or just kind of says, I'm gonna stay grazing." These are horses that mostly give lessons to children and in the camps all summer. So a lot of times we find by the end of the summer they are just so done with people. Even so, there's always somebody, some horse that will come up and say, "You're my person today." Pretty amazing when that happens. And then we do what I call the Dantian press and the Dantian hug, which is a way of relating physically through the energy centers. If the horse is amenable to being touched that way and approached that way and sidled up to that way, then that can be pretty amazing. I love to do that with my horse
Mm. I'm sure there are many things you do with your horse that never grow old.
every day.
I want to know whether there's anything you think we haven't talked about that you want to talk about that you think is important for the listeners to know.
I would like to share my hope that lots of other people involved with horsemanship, especially traditional riding instructors, will pick up on these techniques. I started a group on Facebook called Somatic Horsemanship. And I thought a few of my cronies would join and we would have some nice conversations and I could catch up with people, publicize my book a little bit. Well, within 3 days, there were 150 people on the site from all over the world. I was just blown away. They are such fine people, people that teach yoga and horsemanship, Tai Chi and horsemanship, a lot of people that do body oriented psychotherapies without horses, a lot of people that love horses and have a natural somatic approach with horses, but don't necessarily know anything about therapy. So it's a wonderful, wonderful group. And where we're at is trying to figure out what somatic horsemanship even means.
Mm.
Because you would think all horsemanship, particularly if you're taking riding lessons, is somatic. And we're starting to have this conversation, especially with this one woman who's in some respects a conventional riding instructor who still does a lot of work with energy and with the five senses, that no, A lot of riding instruction is not what we would call somatic in the sense of including compassion and respect for the horse. She has this term called kick and pull horsemanship, and I see it at our ranch, and it kind of breaks my heart because we have about 30 riding instructors at the ranch. And some of them are very much into kick that horse, make it do what you want to do. That horse is being lazy, that horse is being stupid, and there's no heart connection, barely a somatic connection, certainly not an energetic connection in the way that we understand psychospiritual energies. The dream of a lot of people in this group is to make sure that all horsemanship that's been up to now kick and pull or otherwise non-somatic begin to incorporate the ingredients of somatics, which we define as being compassionate and sensory and spiritual.
Including the body, but particularly in psychotherapy, has been similar in that humans have no respect, and they often have a kick and pull relationship with the vehicle they exist in. Much of the early journey is introducing that human being to their body and how it actually is, and to shift the relationship with body from I am the great controller master self, which oversees everything, and my body just does whatever I tell it to do, to this incredible, non-hierarchical, compassionate relationship with the body as a organism, which basically we're totally dependent on and runs everything.
One thing that we address heavily is this idea of body shaming, because the way that people come up in Western society that's so driven by Hollywood, by sport, is to really be ashamed of their bodies and just not want to deal with them at all. One of the things that we emphasize in equanimity is the beauty of all bodies and the sacredness of all bodies, whether you're fat, wrinkled, old, young.
And I also think Qigong and Tai Chi have a big role to play in cultivating that awareness and relationship with the magic that is the human organism. Well, this has been amazing.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
I really cannot encourage enough everybody to get this book and read this book, whether you like horses or not. The knowledge and the quality of the didactic material is so high level. There's absolutely no problem with putting this in the hands of anyone who needs a lot of empirical evidence. This book has it all, and I encourage everyone to go get it. If people want to find out more about the book, but also how to work with you,
they can Google my name, Beverly Kane, MD, and see my website, which is called Horse Sensei, Equine Assisted Learning and Therapy, www.horsesensei.com.
And I just love the name Horse Sensei anyway. It's so perfect. You are a horse sensei.
And the horses are senseis.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.